with the points that she was making actually about identity cards, given that we're told something like 11 million people may not have passports or driving licences, and it's important people can participate. And indeed, I sympathise with many of the points she makes about HS2, because I've got to say, from a Swansea perspective, where we're taking 3 hours to get to Swansea, it's 2 hours to get to Manchester, it'll be 1 hour after HS2, you can get to Edinburgh in 4 hours. And why do people have to travel more and more frequently, more further, when we've got the internet? Why don't we spend some money on building regional economies? At one point, I was the leader of Croydon Council and pioneered a tram link, which is 26 kilometres long, that linked up Beckenham, Croydon and Wimbledon. It cost £200 million. It was half paid by the private sector. So for the 80 billion, you could do 800 of those schemes linking up regional economies. We've got to ask the question whether really strategically it's a good idea enabling people to live further and further from London so they can go back and forth. I think in our infrastructure review we should look across the piece. I should and was going to mention just very briefly, as other people have, Paul Flynn, who is a good friend, a great man, a man of great warmth, integrity, humour and distinction, and he's a sad loss for the House and for the colleagues across Wales. But turning to the Queen's speech, it was good, of course, that the Queen started her speech, as all good speeches really start, with a joke, which was, my government's priority is to have EU, to leave the EU by the 31st of October 2019, because it doesn't look at all likely that's going to happen. And it's an interesting contrast to her opening words in the 2017 Queen's speech, where she didn't say her priority is to leave that. She said, my priority is to secure the best possible deal as the country leaves the EU, working with devolved administrations and business to build consensus. So that's something that's been swept out of the way, and we're rushing towards this deadline, do or die, get Brexit done. When, in our hearts, we all know we can't just get Brexit done. It'll be a series of painful negotiations with deals down the way. The next paragraph, of course, of the speech was about the commitment to financial stability, and it is a sort of strange irony that many of the hedge funds that supported the Prime Minister's leadership, of course, have been betting on no deal. Then next we had financial, sort of fiscal responsibility. Well, the situation now is that the government debt is 90% the size of the economy. When Labour left, it was 40, it was half that. It is the case that we've had years of austerity crushing the poorest, and now we're told loads of money is in the magic money tree from the Prime Minister to spend on all sorts of things. And the fact is that the current government has failed to grow the economy. This is, to be fair, largely due to Brexit and waiting for the uncertainty, not just the uncertainty of Brexit, but the reality of Brexit that will shrink our economy a further 10%. It is the expression "get Brexit done," of course, is very appealing to people because they're sick and tired of talking about Brexit. They want to get Brexit over, and so do I. But my contention is very much that now that people have seen what it's likely to be like, people who voted leave in my constituency are saying they voted for more money, more control, more jobs, and are now seeing they're going to have less money, whether it's in the divorce bill, whether it's a shrinking economy. There'll be less jobs, whether they look at Bridgend pulling out their cars, or Tata Steel making cuts because of Brexit, or with Airbus pulling out. They're going to get less jobs. There will be less control. They can't control the laws in Europe that will ultimately affect us, and they want to have a final say. People on the Conservative side who've traditionally been in favour of the union, in favour of business, are basically turning their back on these things. It's all very well the Prime Minister talking about how he values the union. Clearly, Scotland, if we have Brexit, if they pull out and they're part of the EU, much of the industry in England will move to Scotland. We're talking about the divided kingdom, not the United Kingdom, and people should wake up to this. They pretend that democracy is it consists of listening to the result. Some 3 years ago, when we've had a general election, a result was based on false promises and is seen to be false. People should have another vote. They should have a vote on the deal in front of them. And there's this crazy notion that's been put across that on Saturday, some deal no one's seen should be rushed through because the Prime Minister said do or die on the 31st of October, which is frankly absurd. Moving on, in terms of what was good in the Queen's speech, I welcome the focus on mental health. I only say this because I've got my own regulation of psychotherapists bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, and you may know that the current situation is that you or I tomorrow could set up a psychotherapist without any training, without practising any evidence-based treatment, and the problem we've got there is that many people have been abused by many people who've got problems with mental health. They go to people who call themselves a psychotherapist because it sounds like a professional qualification is needed. And they're basically abused, whether it's conversion therapy, whether it's people who are formerly war veterans being asked to relive their trauma and being worse off, etc., etc. So that's something I think needs to be embraced within the mental health bill. But primarily I wanted to focus, be it briefly, Mr Deputy Speaker, on the Environment Bill and clean air. I have the privilege to chair the all-party group on air pollution. And people may know that 64,000 people die prematurely every year from air pollution, that millions, 2.6 million children, go to school in polluted schools with toxic air. It's just simply not acceptable, and that is affecting their mental health, whether it's depression, anxiety, psychosis, giving rise to dementia, whether it's their physical health, giving rise to heart attacks, lungs, strokes, etc. So this has got to be sorted out, and it is good that it's been mentioned. But of course, the devil is in the detail. And what we need tomorrow, in tomorrow's Environment Bill, is specific targets and timetables with enforcement action. And what I'm particularly talking about now is PM 2.5, which is small enough to penetrate women's wombs and babies who are being carried. And the levels of those should be at World Health Organization standards by 2030. And the only way to do that is to have a trajectory to get those levels, which are the required level is 10 micrograms per cubic metre. And what we want to have clearly is that by 2020 we could bring that down to 20, by 2025, 15, and by 2030, 10. And that would again require that fossil-fuelled cars and new fossil-fuelled cars, whether diesel or petrol, should be banned by 2030 instead of 2042. And this isn't a new other countries doing it. Paris is doing it, Rome is doing it, Denmark's doing it, Sweden's doing it, Ireland's doing it. We can do it if we're serious. And we can also create the conditions which help spark new modern cars and give the incentives and direction to have a modern public transport system that can take us forward. I published my own Clean Air Bill a week ago that also required a fiscal strategy to help support incentives and move people towards a sustainable future that requires information to be known to local parents and local people generally. So if you've got a child at the local school, you can see what their pollution is and you then demand action. And it also would require that the Environment Bill, which in the previous formulation didn't, would have indoor air included. Because, Mr Deputy Speaker, you and I and everybody here spend something like 90% of our time indoors. So how is it we're going to have an Environment Bill which is only for outdoor air, which says they're going to focus on air pollution, given that, unfortunately, these days people are actually faced in their own homes by all sorts of toxins from chemicals in furniture, in cleaning stuff, in sprays, candles, you name it, that actually has a cocktail impact with outdoor air pollution that causes respiratory and inflammatory problems. That needs to be integrated properly so that we can all be protected. On plastics, I've got a plastics bill, as it happens. You'll be here, Buffalo Bill, me, Mr. Deputy Speaker. A plastics bill that suggests that we should move, that we should clearly have aggregate targets, as we do for the Climate Change Act, of the aggregate amount of plastic we're allowed to have. There should be a fiscal strategy of taxation of virgin plastic. Quite simply, plastic is too expensive. If it costs more to buy a plastic bottle than to get one that you can reuse, then clearly people wouldn't buy them. In terms of climate change itself, it is imperative that we move against fracking. The reality is that anything that emits more than 2% methane is worse than coal. Methane itself is something like 85 times worse than CO2 for global warming, and the satellite imagery tells us that fracking generates 5% of fugitive emissions leakages, which makes it nearly twice as bad as coal. It's just not a sustainable way forward. 80% of fossil fuels that are available can't be exploited if we're to avoid irreversible climate change. We now know that we're going to hit the 1.5-degree change, not by 2040, but by 2030. So the zero carbon target of 2050 is already outdated. And it's no good saying, oh, well, we've done a really great job in Britain, because the reason we've got our carbon reductions down so quickly in recent times is because we've closed the coal mines and exported our industry. We need to stop fracking. We need to come forward and have a sustainable transport system. We need to have onshore wind. We know Swansea Bay Lagoon in terms of wave power and other lagoons, and we need to harness the sun's energy as well. Finally, it struck me that listening to the comments from the member for Bournemouth East, who sadly is not in his place now, who talked about the importance in a global environment to hold our own in terms of cyber attacks, critical mass of our military, etc., space. All these arguments lent themselves towards the need to act collectively within Europe to sustain our common values of democracy, human rights and the rule of law. I think it's critically important for our influence and our self-interest and our security and our prosperity and being unified to remain in the EU. And I think it's incumbent upon us to give the final say to the people of Britain. Do they want this deal, or do they want to stay with the deal they've got? And we already know they prefer to stay where they are. The growing numbers of young people coming through feel that as well, and I think we should be duty-bound to give it back to the people for the final say.
Andrew Barr. Thank you very much.